Firstly, just before this episode starts, I'd like to state that this episode was recorded back at the end of May, so some of the conversation topics might be a slight bit out of date. Nevertheless, the overall conversation contains some interesting discussion, and I hope you enjoy. Hello everyone, and welcome back to 404. In this episode, I sat down with Vera Odhrán, a PhD researcher based at the Marine and Renewable Energy Institute and UCC. We talked about everything from renewable energy to greater public transport and the government's recent climate action bill. As always, if you have any questions or comments surrounding the topics discussed in this podcast, you can reach out to us at johnson.business.yt@gmail.com. With that being said, please sit back, relax, and enjoy. Perfect. So we'll get started anyways. Vera, it's great to be talking to you again. It's been too long, as we were talking about beforehand. But for those who don't kind of know you, I suppose, you're a PhD researcher based at the Marine and Renewable Energy Institute and UCC. You graduated with a bachelor's in energy engineering, and your subject of your thesis was on low carbon pathways for passenger transport in Ireland. That's obviously a lot of stuff to get through, and I suppose even probably still to that stage, talking about some of your minor accolades to date. I suppose, how are you getting on at the moment? I suppose the key question always is, whenever I go into one of these calls, is how's COVID been treating you, or how have you been getting used to stuff, since restrictions have eased a little bit?
Been getting on good. So I suppose with the work that I do, it's fortunate that we can all work remotely. We do a lot of our calculations online, so the team's working online, and all our conferences would be online as well now. So it's a handy way to do things. Of course, I miss seeing everyone in person, but it's handy now with the cafes and a few of the parks and stuff opening. I can meet up with some family and some friends. Yeah, so managing away as best we can, I suppose.
Yeah, hopefully more stuff will continue to open in the future, and some of the stuff even we talk about today might come up as a topic for stuff that's reopening. I know the aviation sector is very much in the news at the moment. I kind of want to ask, first of all, out of all the stuff regarding climate action and all the different bits that come around carbon emissions, what made you want to focus specifically on transport?
I think it was a personal passion of mine. I really just love using public transport. I love cycling everywhere. I think transport is so visceral. It's a huge part of our day. A lot of people would spend, you'd hear about the nightmare 2-hour commutes that would be happening in pre-COVID times. And it's one of those things that I don't think people think consciously enough about. It affects, there's noise pollution considerations, there's air quality considerations. Even it can be a part of your exercise routine if you cycle. There's just so many aspects to transport, and it's a really interesting engineering problem to say, oh, what's the best way for people to get from A to B? And depending on who you're talking about, it could be totally different. Like cycling isn't even an option for everyone because not everyone can cycle. Then there's issues of you can't have public transport in rural areas. What are you going to do then? Or, we can't all have all cars in cities because we'll be in traffic till the end of time, and I think those sort of problems are what are so interesting for anyone that likes to look at engineering problems, and these sort of wicked, multidimensional social and technological problems. And transport is such a cool one, really. And that's really what drove me, pun intended, to get into transport. Just how much it seems to affect people on the ground, and it can make a real difference if you get it right.
100%. Maybe just quickly for people who are listening, outline maybe some of the work that you do, or in more specific detail, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. So I work as part of a team called the Energy Policy and Modelling Group. And we use computational models to calculate where our carbon dioxide emissions come from. And there are a couple of different sectors. So you have the agricultural sector, the electricity sector, the residential sector, and I look at the transport sector. And what I do then is looking at all of the cars that we have, other people look at the trucks that we have, looking at how much people take trains, how much people take buses, and what are the fuel consumptions to meet those service demands that we have for transport in Ireland, and look at what would happen to our emissions, our carbon dioxide emissions, which cause global warming, if we decided to change things? So what if we had electric buses instead of diesel buses? What if we decided to cycle more in our cities? What if more people moved to cities in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
And, what if we switched to, biofuel trucks? And what if we had more electric cars in our fleet? So all of those sort of questions are what we look at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were mentioning obviously the transport, and some of the information you sent me on, I was reading through it. I didn't realize how drastic the change was with regards to greenhouse gas emissions between 1990 and 2019, with it going from 9.5% for our greenhouse gas emissions in 1990 for transport, and in 2019 it was upwards of 20.3%, which is a huge gap. And when you look at the sort of the graph, all the other sectors either seem to stay the same or almost go down in some sectors and whatnot, but this seemed to be the big drastic one. You were kind of mentioning to me that it was a lot down to, say, the likes of personal vehicles and freight trucks. Does aviation factor into that at all? Because I was looking as well, and this might be a bit of an out of date source, but I was reading a bit by it was with regards to the Irish Aviation Authority. They were talking about how aviation accounts for about 2% of global CO2 emissions, and that's about 0.6 billion tons of CO2 a year. And when it personally comes to, for lay people talking about, climate change and the ways in which we can tackle climate change, the aviation sector seems to come up all the time, especially with Ireland having such accessibility to cheap flights going anywhere around Europe, even more so cheaper than probably the trains or the buses in some cases.
Yeah.
Are they as important to look at, as opposed to, as you were kind of mentioning to me earlier, about the freight trucks and the personal cars and whatnot with regards to CO2 emissions?
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting question when you look at the legislation and how we account for it in terms of our climate action targets. So if you looked at the climate action plan, what we focus on is everything except for international maritime and aviation. It hasn't been factored in yet. So the methods that they're going to do to tackle that, it wouldn't be in the space that I would research. But I do know there is a lot of interest in the aviation and maritime sector, because heavy transport is quite difficult to decarbonize. Like you can't electrify as easily for heavy weight vehicles as you can for passenger cars. And for aviation and for maritime transport, a lot of the conversations surround biofuels, which involve, growing a crop and using that, or using byproducts to create a liquid fuel that would then be used just like petrol or diesel, except instead of getting it from drilling in the ground, you would get it from, producing it in a factory, from crops or from sewage or from cattle waste. And another thing that's often talked about as well is using hydrogen, particularly, I suppose, for very heavy vehicles. And there's big talk about hydrogen trucks and, perhaps hydrogen planes. But why in the context of 2030 this isn't talked about is because it's not a very well developed technology. Like electric cars have pretty much been brought to market. You can see them being diffused within Ireland, and they are becoming like an emerging technology that governments can factor into their carbon dioxide emissions reduction budgets, so their carbon budgets, where they're saying, great, we'll try and get more EVs out there. But you can't, it's difficult to plan for a technology that hasn't been brought to market yet. That said, though, biofuels are available, and currently we actually do use biofuels in our cars, and nobody has noticed it. We, through the biofuel obligation scheme, started mixing in more and more biofuels, about 5% up to like maybe 6 or 7%, depending on whether you use petrol or diesel. We started that back in 2008, and we're still doing that now. We even did it before 2008, I'd say. And that has actually been a roundabout way of reducing our CO2 emissions. But there is some questions about biofuels that would be raised, because you'd wonder, okay, well, how were the biofuels produced? Were they produced in a sustainable way? Or did it use land that could have otherwise been used to grow crops? Or did it use resources that we could have used for other purposes? And then, there's a really important point about having the biofuels be as sustainable as possible,
Mm-hmm.
And so the EU raised this, and people were chatting about an awful lot within the EU. And so they have brought in legislation since ensuring that, okay, so biofuels are produced from waste products and there's no indirect land use change, and we must prevent that if at all possible. Because what was happening was there were, farmers who were using land that would otherwise grow crops, but they're using it to grow crops to make fuel, instead of growing crops for either feeding livestock or feeding people.
I want to talk a little bit about electric vehicles, because they're obviously going to be the one thing that everyone's going to be aware of. They're the huge talking point when it comes to a more sustainable future. The Climate Action Bill sets out that 840,000 electric vehicles will be sold by 2030. Now, that seems all well and good in practice, and the Climate Bill makes a lot of promises in a lot of different areas, and some people might say that that's too much, or some people might even say it's too little. Electric vehicles are no cheap alternative to the, say, petrol or diesel vehicles, at least to my knowledge anyways, and you feel free to correct me on this if I'm wrong. But when it comes to sort of tackling the issue of climate change and whatnot, is this sort of more of a restricted form of tackling it, because only certain bracket of people who can afford electric vehicles are going to be able to avail of this?
Yeah, I think you really struck on an interesting point there about how perhaps only certain people can afford to switch to electric vehicles as they stand at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because really electric vehicles are sort of at the early adoption stage. They're a new technology, they're high end, and they're expensive. And we're offering people a €5,000 grant off the sales price. And there has been studies from other countries, and this was noted by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. There has been studies from other countries where these sort of grants, they've been regressive in a way where they disproportionately benefit people who are on the higher end of the income spectrum. So it's not a progressive incentive, but it still is an incentive to get an electric vehicle. So there are pros and cons to it. So the cons is that it is regressive, and you need to have a look at who it is targeting. But also at the same time, it is an incentive for an electric vehicle which does not emit CO2 emissions on the road, and it doesn't emit air polluting particles. So they don't emit all the bad stuff that comes from engine exhaust. So there has been an interesting study from Trinity College Dublin, which looked at the issue of forced car ownership and car dependency. And what they found is that there's a lot of public transport black spots and areas of economic deprivation where people have no choice but to own a car, even though they might struggle to afford one. And they have no other choice because there's no public transport. They might be very low population areas. So it doesn't make sense to install a bus service because there won't be enough people there even to take the bus. So what naturally would lead from that idea is perhaps it would make more sense to have these sustainable vehicle grants targeted towards people who have no choice but to own a car. And then they can drive around in a car that then is low carbon. Because what could be happening with the electric vehicle grants as they stand is that perhaps a lot of high income people are benefiting from a €5,000 grant when perhaps they could choose another low carbon option, like, switching from driving to work and cycling to work instead because they live in an urban area that has plenty of cycle lanes, or taking the bus or the DART because a lot of people in higher income areas, they generally can tend to live in urban areas that are high income, and they would have access to public transport. And that could also be an effective way to reduce the emissions in their case.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose that's sort of the thinking, that there needs to be a little bit more thought about, okay, so we have this €5,000 grant incentive, but is it working in the way that we intended?
Mm-hmm.
So it is still an open question. And I think it's something definitely worth looking into. And particularly, I think the fact that it's regressive rather than progressive, for some people, that might be an important issue to say, hey, we need to revisit this. What about people who are in forced car ownership? Or, you know, it's all well and good to incentivize electric vehicles. But if you give someone an electric vehicle and it means that they're going to choose driving over taking the bus and reducing traffic, then you might be unintentionally exacerbating a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where policymaking gets so interesting, because when you're planning these things, you need to think about the unintended consequences of your actions. You might say an EV grant, great, we're going to reduce fuel car use and get in EVs that don't use petrol and diesel. Lovely. But what are the unintended consequences, and what are, you know, the inequalities or missed opportunities that arise because of this?
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, the public transport question is always an interesting one. And even when it comes to politics as well, every general election, public transport is always one of the big issues as well, because even like, you know, you think of some of the urban hotspots like Dublin and all that, you know, public transport is still a long ways off from being something sustainable for a lot of people. You know, I myself live, you know, what would be considered 40 minutes out from the city, but yet I have to get a bus that takes about an hour and a half and only runs every hour.
Yeah.
I think as well, another interesting factor that always comes up as well is that Ireland's rail system, I think, was better off 50 years ago than it is today. You know, places like Donegal were serviced and now it's not, which is kind of, well, funny in some cases, but not for the people living in Donegal. And the same with regards to Meath as well. There's always talk about getting a train to Navan and whatnot. Is the bigger question sort of, if it was sort of a choice between the two of having people in forced car situations to have an electric vehicle, would it be more favorable in that sense to expand public transport to a much more efficient level? So say bringing that train to Navan, bringing it back to Donegal, expanding the bus routes, making their vehicles more electric and whatnot. Is that a more favorable outcome, or is it a blended approach of the both?
This is where the questions get really interesting, because they're really, really complicated. And, you know, I in the absence of fact, I think we turn to opinion on this. Mm-hmm. So I would say this is why transport, I said this earlier, transport is so interesting from this point of view, because it's so complicated and tangled, and even it comes into even housing issues, like how do we plan our cities, where do we all decide to live, you know, and you have all these different people living in different places, and they have all these different journeys they need to take, and how can we service them in the most efficient way possible? It sounds like an endlessly complicated computer problem. you know, I think you need a mega super duper computer to solve that one. So I think the blended approach would be the best way to go with this. And I would answer this with one key issue with any routes decided for public transport. You need to focus on occupancy. Mm-hmm. So an electric train will never be more efficient than an electric car if you don't hit a certain number of occupants, okay? And that's just pure looking from an energy consumption point of view. Obviously, with an electric train, or well, not so obviously actually, with an electric train, you would reduce some traffic issues, okay? So rather than having, you know, 17 cars, you would have 17 people on the one vehicle, and that would reduce traffic. But because there's a heavier weight and a heavier load, then perhaps, and this is perhaps, it depends on the type of technology or how advanced it gets with the electric trains versus the electric cars, perhaps there might be a higher electricity consumption per person if, let's say, you have 3 people on an electric train versus, 3 electric cars running on the road, one person in it each. So I think the best approach would be, let's see what routes are really popular with people. What routes are a lot of people traveling? Where are the transport hotspots? What are the transport hotspot times? And making sure that, there is a good public transport service that is tailored to when people are traveling the most, so it suits them. And then in areas where there's really low demand, then you'd go with the individualized transport option, because you're never going to have traffic issues on a Bohereen out in North Mayo. So then looking at public transport to service that, it might not be feasible. Even though, again, to consider, and now this is another layer to the transport nexus, is the issue of, and this is something that I think doesn't get enough mention at all, is transportation justice. Because a lot of transport planning operates under the assumption that everyone can drive a car, and not everyone can drive a car. In fact, I mean, I don't know about you, but I know from my rural upbringing, the dreaded asking your parents for the spin into town. And even just being able to, as a teenager, to be able to have that transport autonomy to hop on a bus and go meet up with your friends, I think has a really important, psychological well-being aspect to it. And I do think there is a big issue around, over-reliance on cars, over-reliance on people being able to drive cars, afford them, and I always like to think about this in a way that, you'd have people thinking, oh, back in the day we all played on the streets, and why don't children play on the streets anymore? Well, they don't play on the streets because, there's 1-ton cars driving down the roads at, even in towns, they'd be going down at 30 to 50 kilometers per hour. And that's pretty fast. I wouldn't play a game of football there either, and you kind of have to ask, just all the sacrifices we've made to have our towns work around cars. What have we lost because of it? And I do not think people have really thought about the car dependency question in that way in Ireland. And if you did think about it, I think you get pretty sad. A lot of space is taken up for parking. It mightn't be the nicest place to walk. There might be road space where there's no footpaths. And that doesn't make for a very friendly town that you could just go for a lovely stroll down.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point to make as well, because especially in growing up in Ireland, the one thing is, I think Irish parents have a whole idea of saying, oh, you won't know yourself once you get the car, and, the independences it'll bring you. And, for the most part, a lot of that is really down to because there's no other infrastructure in place for people, as you mentioned, to get around and do bits and pieces. It's all reliant on cars. And even, you can look at some of the stuff in Dublin as well. I know the Green Party gets a lot of flack for the stuff they do on council level in Dublin with regards to greenways and all that, but the pushback from people as well, which I think in some areas is just. I think the Green Party go a bit far sometimes, but some areas is just as well, because people are constantly pushing back against these greenways because they're like, well, where will I put my car, where will the cars go, and all this. So there is obviously, I think, a long ways to go before we make it a more sustainable transport solution in Ireland. But maybe it could be, I don't know, you're the expert on this, could it be done in a in a much more time efficient outlook on the future with regards to it? What kind of needs to be done in order for that to be sort of the reality in the close rather than long-term future?
The passenger transport question is a really difficult one because it involves a lot of change to people's personal lives. And you're asking people to consider other options for transport, and you also need to set up the systems so that then the choice is easier. So making the switch to a different mode choice, let's say let's say you live in maybe a fairly suburban area, and you're maybe 2 or 3 kilometers from your nearest shop, and you want to do the shop. A lot of people would take the car for that, perhaps. And how do you encourage that switch to a different mode type? and these are the kind of questions I think that a lot of transportation researchers would look at, and then we try to model, okay, what would happen if we improve cycling infrastructure? What would happen if there was a bus rapid transit system that was actually rapid, like rather than the hour and a half that you mentioned about waiting for the bus and taking the bus and it takes ages? What if it actually worked as it should? And like there has been a lot of research done and a lot of examples shown from European countries that if you set up the infrastructure, like people do use it. Proper segregated cycling infrastructure actually means that people are happy to cycle up to like 20% further than they normally would with roadside lanes.
Mm-hmm.
And as well, by like implementing like bus rapid transit systems or like rail systems, if they work as they should, I know just from looking at public transportation leaders in the Netherlands and as well in Berlin as well. So in the Netherlands, we're mainly looking at Amsterdam and Rotterdam as well, and Utrecht. Like the public transport uptake is a good bit higher, and the cycling uptake in the Netherlands, obviously, it's like the classic example, is about 10% of all passenger kilometers are by bike. Whereas in Ireland, it's less than 1%.
Mm-hmm.
And like the terrain is much flatter in the Netherlands, so that could be perhaps a contributing factor. But they do have the segregated cycle lanes, and they do have the cycling culture as well. Mm-hmm. And I think another thing that is coming down the tracks that a lot of people would be quite interested in are new technologies that maybe make it easier to make that mode of choice again. So what we see coming up now are e-bikes. So even though, Cork is quite hilly, in an e-bike, it's quite manageable. And there were studies that show, some studies done sprinkled around the place on e-bikes that showed that in the Netherlands, a study showed that people who switched from bikes to e-bikes, they traveled 50% further, and they cycled 50% more of the time than what they did before they switched. And it just makes it again easier for people who perhaps wouldn't be able to use a mechanical bike.
Yeah, no, that's it's a brilliant point. Yeah, because I was kind of I keep a loose approach. You always kind of keep up with the news and whatnot. But even in Dublin as well, that the push towards sort of making e-scooters sort of more of a norm thing as well. And I think it all kind of starts as well with the whole bikes on demand almost in Dublin, where you put your card in, you go down and all that, which I don't know has been successful to varying degrees, I would argue. With a huge thing that always comes around when talking about climate change, and this will go into the transport sector as well, as always, agriculture. And there's you reminded me of a very dark video that I had to watch once in a while ago by Michael Healy-Rae, which was released on the 20th of April this year. Because I always enjoy going back to it, because it's so dramatic and dramatized in so many different ways that it makes it look like as if the end of the world is coming with this climate action bill. And you rightfully,
very well made video.
It is, yeah. I was genuinely thinking he was giving me a run for my money, like I couldn't believe it, like. But I was looking there because I couldn't believe it when you pointed out, it's amassed such a large intake of views. I think it's sitting at 381,000 views at the moment. Nearly half of what the electric vehicles being bought in would be like. So just with regards to it, one of the claims that he makes in it is that you can't electrify a fishing trawler or a tractor or whatnot. That's just not feasible. But we talked about biofuels earlier. You were kind of mentioning that there's no real incentive, particularly in the climate action bill, to make all tractors electric. Like, you're not going to go down to the middle of Kerry and have someone with their Tesla tractor out back, doing the bales. Like, it's not going to be a thing. Like, so maybe walk us through a little bit, just kind of for people who are kind of worried about, and I say worried very loosely, like about the sort of impacts that the climate action bill will have on the agricultural sector for people in the future, kind of ease their minds a little bit, I suppose, on sort of what that means for vehicles within the agricultural sector.
Yeah, so I can talk about vehicles in the agricultural sector. Anything beyond that, definitely, I'd have to put on my opinion hat rather than my fact hat, because it's not my research area. So in Michael Healy-Rae's video, he did mention, he was like, you can't have an electric tractor. And it did draw on my earlier point that, it's really hard to electrify large vehicles. So you're talking trucks and tractors and, even airplanes as well. The technology it's coming on board. I'm sure some listeners might have heard about, Tesla's sparkly electric trucks and all that sort of thing. But even at that, like most electric vehicles, they're pretty expensive. Yeah, they would be pretty expensive. And any new technology, when it starts off, it's going to be pricey. So, like, what I would say about this is, first of all, a mention of having electric tractors, it doesn't come up in the Climate Action Plan as far as I know. I did a search on electric tractors. If you've seen the Climate Action Plan, it's pretty long, so I can't claim to have every word of it ironed into my mind. But as far as I recall, no mention of electric tractors. It doesn't come up in our modelling tools either. It doesn't really come up in any of our questions, so we don't really expect anyone to be, forking out big for electric tractors. And what could be possible, and this is a really exciting thing, I think, for farmers as well, is that biofuels can be mixed in with fossil fuels. And this fossil fuel mix can be used in tractors and it can be used in trucks as well. And the great thing about biofuels as well is that biofuels can be produced here in Ireland. So we actually import a lot of our fossil fuels because we don't have any massive oil reserves, really, and that actually is a big issue for like energy security, but it also is quite bad, for a balance of exports and imports, so we want to be exporting more than we import, and that's good for the Irish economy, I suppose. I'm not an economist, but I would imagine that it's better if we're able to provide more of our resources ourselves if we can. So the great thing about biofuels is that we could produce them ourselves in Ireland, and then we can use them in Ireland, and we're importing less. And biofuels can be produced using cattle waste or silage waste, or they can be produced using waste oils or waste crops. I know there's some very interesting projects going on about potentially producing biofuels from byproducts and waste products from beer manufacturing. I mean, as far as I know, and that a lot of that research, and I'll point you in the direction of a group of people who would know far more about this than I would. A lot of research is being done by the UCC biofuels group, and that would be all in the vicinity of Professor Jerry Murphy. He's quite well known. He was on the Rubber Bandits podcast, I remember, a couple of months back as well, talking about biofuels and bioenergy and the role they can play. And actually, farmers could get involved with setting up and having anaerobic digesters, which could then produce and sell fuel. And that fuel could also be used in their tractors. And you could make money. And this has been done quite extensively in Sweden and also in as well the Netherlands as well. And there are anaerobic digestions set up here in Ireland where people are using it to produce liquid biofuels that can be used for more sustainable transport. And even I think Michael Healy-Rae would get fierce excited about any excuse to make some money, put farmers in a job. I even hear there's talk of making biofuels from seaweed, and that would be great for some coastal communities. I know they're looking into it down in the along the Kerry coastline, and they're doing a lot of research. The UCC biofuels group within Marai into how perhaps seaweed could be used as a feedstock to make biofuels. So really interesting stuff going on. So no need to worry about electric tractors just yet,
One other bit I kind of want to finally touch on anyways is, you mentioned to me in a bit that you sent on earlier about remote working, and that's something we've become all too familiar with over the last year. for better and for worse, I suppose, in some ways. And we were talking a bit about it earlier. I want to mention specifically about how there were certain barriers to stuff like electric vehicles and whatnot, which would be around, certain economic backgrounds and things like that. With regards to the remote learning, you kind of pointed out that if people took 2 days of work at home over the course of the time, emissions would drop by 400,000 tons. And with that being said, it's definitely a real sizable amount as well, especially when we take it into account. One of the things I think we've all learned from the last year, though, is that with regards to remote learning, obviously that's only going to be applicable for certain sectors. But then on top of that as well, it's going to be wholly dependent on broadband, which is a huge thing for a lot of people at the moment, which even where I am situated in Dublin, broadband is woeful. So I would hate to even imagine what it's like down the countryside and in different areas of rural communities. Is that a barrier that's been kind of looked into with regards to how something like this would be approached, or is the 400,000 tons kind of just taking it on face value that broadband would be accessible to all these people?
Yeah, you've pointed out a great thing that perhaps I could factor in as a coefficient into my models to make them even better. Having a 0.0 an 80%, assume 80% proper broadband coverage, but not possible for the other 20%. So I suppose best way to tackle this question is just to highlight some of the underlying assumptions that we get from some of our numbers. So when we're modeling an entire country, you do make your assumptions, and it's a duty of researchers to say, okay, we have this number, but it does have caveats or assumptions with it, and it's a guideline. It's not Bible. It's not. It's when you're modeling, and any modelers in any walk of life, economists or financial modelers, experience this issue, I suppose, or this point, is that models are never 100% accurate. We make educated assumptions, and we do our duty and we do our research as best we can to come up with an estimated figure. And so this estimated figure looks at what tasks can be done remotely, and then it applies, okay, so what if then you convert that into full-time employees, and then 2/5 of that, so 2 days per week, 2/5 is work from home. And then you apply that into, okay, so what do we know about what's modeled? Again, this is an estimated figure about how many kilometers do people take to travel to and from work every day. And that's where you get the 400,000 tons figure. So it doesn't factor into account broadband coverage, but it does factor into account, okay, only certain tasks can be done from home. It does factor in, okay, it's two days per week, and it does factor into account, okay, this is how much people take to travel to work. And I think the thing about remote working is, even if let's say we added in a factor, okay, I can just do it in my head now, like, okay, so maybe only 80% of people can actually do it because of bad broadband, or even less, 50%. So then you're talking 200,000, or you're talking 300,000 tons of CO2 equivalent, and that is still a significant amount. And as well, then there's 100 different things you could factor in. Perhaps some people are fully remote. What if we found from another survey that the ideal amount of days people wanted to work, instead of it being just 2 work from home, it was, because some people like to work 3, it was maybe like 2.5, or it was 2.7. So okay, you could change those figures. So you can keep changing those figures to your heart's content, and you get slightly varying figures. And that's where the fun part of modeling comes in. It's kind of like, oh, well, what if we factored in, you could factor in so many different kinds of things, but you kind of have to stop yourself and say, right, this is where, like, these are our assumptions, this is how we did it. And that's how you kind of justify it, because there are 1,000 other questions you need to answer. If I asked you, all right, can you give me a number for how many blades of grass there are in Ireland? God, you couldn't possibly go out there and count every single one. But what you do then, the art of modeling, you do then, right, how many fields? What's the average number of blades of grass in a square meter? Okay, that's our guess. That's as best we can do.
Well, I think overall this conversation's been really thought-provoking, engaging, and I certainly have learned a lot, and I hope people listening have too. I suppose, is there anything else that really we need to touch on before I finish up, or have we kind of covered all bases of what you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I think we've had a great conversation. We chatted about active modes of travel. We talked about remote working, like electric vehicles. Gosh, we really got through a lot. Michael Healy even came up, and I even got to go on a big tangent about modeling. Oh my gosh, bless you, Odhrán. I'm like, this is a lot of work for the weekend. So yeah, honestly, it's just been great to chat. And as with any heavy science topic, I'd love to just throw in the last point that if there's anything that anyone thinks is, oh wait, I think I thought of another number, or I'd love to add another fact, or oh, I don't think you got this fact quite right, because we covered a lot of topics, like anaerobic digestion and biofuels as well. There's always people, there's always people who would know far more about this topic than I would as well. There's so much information out there, and it's all fantastic and excellent research being done. So I can't claim to always have to be able to be as up to date with literature probably as I should be. I really hope. I hope my supervisors don't do this. So if anyone has any additions or corrections they'd like to make, I would just say comment way down, tweet me, anything at all, and we can correct it or fix it. That's all. Yeah.
Perfect. It's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much, Vera.